June 21st, 1984. Gatwick Airport, 3:12 a.m. The cameras weren't here yet. No champagne, no headlines, no bravado. Just a plane, massive, silent, sitting alone on a dark tarmac, and a number that wouldn't move fast enough. Seats. Inside the terminal, a small group of staff hunched over printed manifests, red pens in hand, running the same calculation over and over, as if staring at it long enough might change the answer. It didn't. A half-empty plane wasn't just an embarrassment. It was a death sentence. Every seat was tied to debt. Every empty row, a quiet subtraction from a balance sheet already stretched to snapping point. Virgin Records, the stores, the studios. All of it leveraged, all of it exposed. For once, there was no angle to play, no stunt to pull, no story to spin, just one brutal question hanging in the fluorescent-lit silence. What if nobody shows up? Somewhere out on the tarmac, Richard Branson walked the length of the aircraft alone, one hand trailing along the cold metal of the fuselage. No audience, no performance, just a man and the machine he'd staked everything on. This is what risk actually looks like. Not adrenaline, not bravado, silence, uncertainty. The very real possibility that by this time tomorrow, everything he'd built would be gone. By sunrise, the terminal would be full, the music loud, the smile back in place. But for a few hours in the dark, before the story had an ending, even Richard Branson didn't know if this was going to work. June 22nd, 1984. Gatwick Airport. Most inaugural flights are champagne and handshakes, a ribbon, a speech, a photo for the morning papers. This one was different. Branson had one plane, just one, a leased Boeing 747, and his entire life's work was riding on it. Virgin Records, the studios, the retail empire, all of it cross-collateralized to fund this single aircraft. If the plane flew half-empty, the Virgin name would be gone by Monday morning. The press weren't calling it a launch. They were calling it a funeral. But as the wheels left the tarmac, Branson wasn't watching the balance sheet. He was watching faces. He'd replaced the gray plastic misery of commercial aviation with ice cream, high-end headsets, and a stubborn refusal to take any of it seriously. He wasn't just running an airline. He was making a point. This is the story of a boy who couldn't read a chalkboard, who ran a magazine from a payphone, and who figured out that the most effective way to beat a monopoly is to make them look boring. This is Richard Branson. To understand the billionaire, you have to understand the boy. Richard Branson was born in 1950, at a time when intelligence meant one thing: sit down, memorize, and perform. For a child with severe dyslexia, the classroom wasn't a place of learning. It was a daily humiliation. His headmaster, on the day he left school at 16, looked him in the eye and delivered this verdict: Branson, you will either end up in prison or become a millionaire. He wasn't entirely wrong. The letters still dance on the page. They always have. But while his classmates were memorizing Latin conjugations, Richard was developing something no textbook could teach: the ability to read people. Because he couldn't rely on text, he learned to rely on instinct. He learned to delegate to friends who were better at maths. He learned to take the most complicated idea in the room and reduce it to a story anyone could follow in 30 seconds. That habit, radical simplification, would become the secret engine of the entire Virgin Empire. The rule was straightforward. If Branson couldn't understand a business pitch in 5 minutes, he wouldn't do the deal. Full stop. At 16, he didn't just leave school. He declared war on the status quo. He launched Student Magazine. No office, no investors, no desk. He ran the whole operation from a cramped basement using a single public payphone. And when it came time to convince major corporations to buy advertising, he told them their competitors had already signed up. They hadn't. It was a bluff. A beautiful, high-stakes bluff. And it worked. It taught him something he'd carry for the rest of his career. Fake the scale until you create the scale. The bluff got him in the door. But getting in the door and actually running a business are two very different things. Orders started arriving for his mail-order record service. At first, it felt like momentum. Proof the idea had legs. Then came reality. Wrong records shipped. Payments delayed. Suppliers demanding cash up front. Customers demanding refunds he didn't have. Cash flow, the silent killer of small businesses, tightened like a noose. There was no system, no accounting department, no safety net, just a teenager, a growing pile of mistakes, and the creeping realization that enthusiasm doesn't pay invoices. For the first time, a thought crossed his mind he'd never quite had before. This might collapse. Not dramatically, not in headlines, quietly, embarrassingly. The kind of failure that simply disappears. But instead of shutting it down, Branson did something that would become a pattern across his entire career. He simplified, cut the complexity, focused on what actually worked, leaned on people who understood what he didn't. It didn't fix everything, but it kept the lights on, and more importantly, it taught him the rule that would underpin every Virgin company that followed. Growth doesn't kill you. Complexity does. Why the name Virgin? Because, as Branson put it, they were complete virgins in business, self-deprecating, cheeky, and just scandalous enough for 1970. He noticed that record shops were cold and transactional. You walked in, you bought a record, you left. Branson wanted something different. He put beanbags on the floor. He let people listen to music for hours without buying anything. He turned a purchase into an experience. And in doing so, invented a template he'd use across every industry he entered for the next 50 years. In 1973, Branson took the biggest creative risk of his young career. Every major label in London had already passed on a quiet, awkward musician named Mike Oldfield. The reason? His music had no lyrics, no chorus, no radio-friendly hook. It was a 49-minute instrumental odyssey he called Tubular Bells. Branson loved it. He bet the house on it. When that track ended up soundtracking one of the most terrifying horror films of the decade, The Exorcist, Virgin Records went from a niche indie label to a global name almost overnight. It cemented the philosophy Branson would return to again and again: back the person, not the product. When EMI dropped the Sex Pistols for being too dangerous, Branson didn't hesitate. He signed them on a boat, moored provocatively on the Thames, directly in front of the Houses of Parliament. He'd figured out something most marketing departments are still catching up to. Bad PR beats no PR every single time. He wasn't selling vinyl. He was selling the feeling of sticking it to the establishment, and the establishment was buying. By 1984, Branson was comfortable, but not empire wealthy. Then a phone call arrived from a lawyer named Randolph Fields with the suggestion that, by any sane measure, was completely absurd. Start an airline. Everyone in the room told him the big players would crush him. And they were right to worry. Because when British Airways realized that Virgin Atlantic was more than a publicity stunt, that it was actually pulling passengers. They didn't compete. They went to war. This wasn't aggressive competition. This was corporate espionage. Under the quiet direction of BA's leadership, a secret unit was assembled, codenamed Helios. Their mission? Systematically hunt Virgin's passengers. BA operatives gained unauthorized access to Virgin's seat booking system. When they identified a high-value passenger booked on a Virgin flight, the playbook ran in 3 steps. First, the interception. Call the passenger, posing as Virgin staff, and regretfully inform them their flight had been delayed or canceled. Second, the switch. Offer them a convenient alternative on BA, usually with a complimentary upgrade. Third, the slander. Quietly feed stories to the press suggesting Branson's planes were unsafe and his empire was quietly crumbling. It was methodical, it was ruthless, and it nearly worked. Most CEOs in Branson's position would have settled quietly. But Branson understood something. If he didn't fight, he was finished anyway. So, he sold Virgin Records, his baby, the thing he'd built from a payphone in a basement, for $1 billion to EMI. He needed a war chest. When the case settled in 1993, BA was ordered to pay £610,000 in damages plus £3 million in legal costs. Branson took his personal share of the settlement and distributed every single penny equally among his staff. He called it the BA bonus. He didn't just win a lawsuit. He bought the lifelong loyalty of an entire workforce and handed the press the perfect headline. In one move, a legal victory became the most powerful piece of culture building in Virgin's history. The headlines called it a masterstroke, $1 billion war chest, a strategic sacrifice. Strip away that language, and what was left didn't feel like a victory. It felt like loss. Virgin Records wasn't just another company. It was the beginning. The basement, the payphone, the first proof that the system could be beaten on his terms. And now it was gone. Sold to fund a fight he still wasn't certain he could win. There were no cameras for this part, no audience, no performance, just the quiet weight of a decision that couldn't be undone, made in a room that history wouldn't bother to record. Because this time, the risk wasn't abstract. He hadn't bet on an idea. He'd traded his past for a chance at a future, and he wouldn't know for years whether it had been worth it. Most entrepreneurs talk about risk like it's a game. Selling Virgin Records was what it actually costs. People always ask the same question. Why does a man with £1 billion empire keep putting his life on the line? Branson's answer was straightforward. If you're a small company, you have to find ways to get on the front page without spending millions on advertising. Every stunt was a calculated trade. When he crashed his balloon into the Atlantic, the world watched the word Virgin cycle through news broadcasts for 3 straight days. The cost of the balloon, a rounding error. The media value generated, estimated north of £50 million. But there was another layer the press often missed. These weren't photo opportunities with a safety net. He nearly drowned in the Atlantic. He nearly froze to death over the Pacific. The stunts revealed something true about Branson that no press release ever could. That he genuinely needed the edge of the cliff to feel alive. That the risk wasn't performance. It was personality. Branson's entire philosophy of leadership can be compressed into a single sentence he's repeated for decades. Train people well enough so they can leave. Treat them well enough so they don't want to. He abolished the Human Resources Department and replaced it with People and Culture. He banned the tie, not as a quirk, but as a statement about the kind of hierarchy he refused to build. He told his managers to say yes more than they said no. He believed with absolute conviction that a company's culture isn't built in boardrooms. It's built in the moments when nobody's watching. We have to talk about the failures. And no failure was louder than Virgin Cola. Branson declared war on Coca-Cola. Literally. He drove a tank into Times Square. He blasted their branded cans off a display wall. The press loved every second of it. Then he lost. Badly. Why? Because he'd broken his own rule. He hadn't offered a better product. He'd offered a different brand. And brand alone, without a genuine functional advantage, isn't enough to unseat a cultural institution that has been living rent-free in the world's muscle memory for a century. It taught him the lesson that would guide every venture after. The brand opens the door, but the product has to make the incumbent look obsolete. Virgin brides, virgin cars. They're in the graveyard alongside the cola. But Branson's response to failure was always consistent. What he called fail fast. Don't let a dying venture drain the life out of the healthy ones. Cut the cord. Bank the lesson. Move. How does one brand work for an airline, a bank, a mobile network, and a space company? In conventional marketing theory, this is called brand dilution. Branson called it brand elasticity, and it followed a 3-step formula he applied every single time. Step 1. Find the fat cat. Branson looked for industries where the dominant players had grown arrogant, where customers were being overcharged, underserved, and quietly furious, but had nowhere else to go. Music in the 70s, airlines in the 80s, banking in the 90s. The pattern was always the same: an entrenched giant who'd forgotten what it felt like to be afraid. Step 2. Add the virgin twist. He asked one question. What does everyone hate about this industry? Airlines, the food, and the boredom. His solution: seat-back TVs and a bar at the back of the plane in 1984 before anyone else had thought of it. Mobile phones, contracts that locked you in for years. His solution: pay as you go, no strings. Trains, grime and delays, and the feeling that no one gave a damn. His solution: modernized fleets and staff who were actually trained to care. Step 3. Make it personal. While other CEOs hid behind legal teams and press officers, Branson put his face on the billboard. He understood something fundamental. People forgive a person far more readily than they forgive a corporation. By being the relatable billionaire, the one who'd drive a tank and ride a hot air balloon and laugh at himself on camera, he made every virgin product feel human, fallible, genuinely on your side. Most billionaires buy private islands to escape the world. Branson bought one to try and fix it. While the tabloids covered the celebrity parties and the kite surfing, a more serious project was taking shape behind the palm trees. In 2007, Branson, alongside musician Peter Gabriel and Nelson Mandela, co-founded the Elders, a group of independent global leaders, freed from the constraints of political office, brought together to tackle problems that formal diplomacy had consistently failed to solve. The logic of hosting these conversations on Necker was deliberate. Remove the pomp of state visits. Take away the motorcades, the security details, the formal dining. Put world leaders at a breakfast table in their flip-flops and see what becomes possible. From post-election violence in Kenya to peace negotiations in Sudan, the elders moved the needle in ways that official channels couldn't. It was Branson's simplification principle applied to geopolitics. Strip away the ceremony, and the problem gets smaller. For decades, Branson was the ultimate consumerist icon, the man who sold you the record, the flight, the fizzy drink, and the gym membership. The third act of his career looks very different. He backed Virgin Hyperloop, electric propulsion, magnetic levitation, low-pressure tube travel, promising the speed of a flight at a fraction of the carbon footprint. He became a founding member of the B Team, a coalition pushing corporations to treat people and planet as equal measures of success, alongside profit. Necker Island itself became a living laboratory for renewable energy, with a stated goal of going entirely fossil fuel-free. The message, delivered with characteristic Branson simplicity: you don't have to sacrifice growth to go green. You just have to innovate faster than the problem. Not everyone bought it. Not everyone bought it. For every announcement about clean energy, there was a counterpoint. For every pledge of sustainability, a question the press wasn't going to let go. Can you really build an empire on consumption and then pivot to conservation, airlines, space travel, global tourism, industries built on movement, on fuel, on scale, all flying the same flag that was now talking about carbon reduction? To some observers, it didn't look like transformation. It looked like rebranding. Softer language wrapped around the same fundamental machine. Branson's response was never defensive. His argument was pragmatic, almost blunt. If the future is going to be built by businesses anyway, would you rather they ignore the problem or try imperfectly to solve it? It wasn't a clean answer, but then again, nothing in his story ever was. For years, space had been sold as the next great adventure, a frontier, a dream, a headline waiting to happen. Space doesn't care about narratives. In October 2014, during a test flight over the Mojave Desert, that reality arrived without warning. Spaceship Two broke apart mid-air. One pilot didn't make it home. The other survived, barely. There are moments in every high-risk endeavor where the language has to change, where innovation becomes investigation, where progress is replaced by a single unavoidable question: should this continue? For Branson, this wasn't theoretical anymore. This wasn't a balloon drifting off course over the Atlantic, a story he could retell at dinner parties with a grin. This was irreversible. A line had been crossed. From risk to consequence, from adventure to grief. The stunts and the headlines and the carefully cultivated persona of the fearless optimist. None of it was available to him in that moment, just the weight of it. The kind that doesn't photograph well and doesn't make for a clean narrative arc, because pushing boundaries sounds heroic, right up until the moment something breaks, and the cost turns out to be someone else's life. For 17 years after founding Virgin Galactic, critics called it vaporware. There were engineering crises. There were crashes. There were deaths. The challenge of building a private suborbital vehicle capable of carrying civilians to the edge of space was, by any reasonable measure, nearly impossible. On July 11th, 2021, Richard Branson reached space. He looked directly into the camera and said, "To all you kids down there, if we can do this, just imagine what you can do." Whether you find that moving or maddening probably depends on how you feel about the man, but the line captured something true about him. The dyslexic kid who couldn't read the chalkboard, strapped into a rocket he'd spent 2 decades trying to build, telling children that the rules aren't as fixed as they look. He wasn't wrong. Conclusion. The legacy of the rebel Richard Branson didn't build a business, he built a philosophy. That complexity is the enemy of progress. That fun is a legitimate business metric. That being the underdog, when you use it right, is the greatest competitive advantage you can have. He turned no into not yet. He turned dyslexia into a management system. He turned a balloon crash into a marketing campaign. He turned a lawsuit into a staff bonus. He turned a classroom verdict into a 40-year argument with the establishment, and he won it. From a basement in London to the edge of the atmosphere, the thesis was always the same. The rules were written by people no smarter than you, and they are meant to be broken. At 16, a headmaster made a prediction. Branson, you will either end up in prison or become a millionaire. It sounded like a warning, a life constrained to 2 outcomes, failure or success, ruin or riches, prison or fortune. The kind of verdict a teacher delivers thinking it will haunt the student who hears it. But it missed something. Because the story was never really about money, and it was never really about rules. He didn't end up in prison. He didn't just become a millionaire. He became something far more difficult to define. A man who treated the system itself as negotiable, who looked at industries that hadn't changed in decades and asked the question that most people are quietly trained out of asking. Why does it have to be this way? And then, more importantly, what happens if it isn't? The rules were written by people no smarter than you. And if that's true, they can be rewritten. If you want more stories about the people who rewired the modern world, subscribe.